including the famous South African who has advised Rwandese government, Greg Mills, in his book, Why Africa is Poor and What Africa Can Do About It, have asserted that Africans are poor because their leaders have chosen that path. It therefore gladdens me that I have been invited to speak in the presence of elected leaders. It has also been said that one of the reasons why corruption thrives in Africa is because Africa is in the business of canonizing thieves and sanctifying and celebrating the wrong people while it vilifies her good men and women. It has also been argued that Africans are in the business of punishing small thieves and electing the big ones into public office. And that is why, therefore, when one is asked to speak about corruption in Africa, one must ask the question why it is that Africa has never succeeded in this fight. I can't agree more that there is a place for legislation in Africa. But those who have observed Africa have also said that the problem of the fight against corruption in Africa is not the shortage of legislation. In fact, Africa has forests of legislation which are honored in breach. Which begs the question, what is the problem? The problem in Africa is that we have succeeded, rather paradoxically, to create an environment which allows thieving and thievery to blossom and thrive. We have created an environment that ensures that our men and women who engage in graft occupy positions of power and influence. And therefore, when one is asked to ask, what is it that other African countries have done in the fight against corruption which we can emulate, one must remind oneself that there have been a number of countries in Africa which have succeeded in the fight against corruption. And the reason why they have succeeded is because the leadership in those countries have demonstrated by word and deed that they mean what they say in the fight against corruption. As I said a few minutes before, African countries are quick to sign international instruments that speak against corruption. If you look at the countries which were the first to ratify the UN Convention Against Corruption, African countries were in the forefront. If you look at the countries which were quick to adopt protocols that speak against corruption, African countries were in the forefront, and Nigeria was never far behind. If you look at the countries which adopted legislation against corruption, it is African countries. In other words, African countries have the inclination to sign anything on sight without doing what those things require and demand of them. So, it is not legislation in and of themselves. It is something else. It is the culture that we have evolved over the years in Africa of celebrating ill-gotten wealth. It is not the shortage of political pronouncements in many African countries. Those who occupy political leadership when they seek political office will invariably say that we are going to fight against corruption. But many times, in the fight against corruption, their understanding of it is that they should appear to be fighting corruption without actually fighting corruption. So the question that we must ask ourselves, what must we do, we who have the privilege and honor of serving our country for combating and preventing corruption, which is the continental instrument that allows African countries to participate in the fight against corruption through collaboration. And it can be done through regional efforts. In the ECOWAS region, the ECOWAS environment provides an opportunity for Nigeria and the countries in this part of the world an opportunity to engage in the fight against corruption in a positive manner. It has never been lost on me that the day Nigeria rises, that is the day Africa rises. You may not know, but 1 out of every 5 Africans is a Nigerian. And the reason, in my view, why Africa continues to totter in the manner that it does is because Nigeria has never realized our potential. The day Nigeria realizes our potential, that is the day that Africa will rise. So we are here today also to remind Nigeria that it must play her leadership role, not only in this region, but in Africa, by demonstrating by word and deed that Nigeria will be in the forefront in the fight against corruption. And it's not only at the continental level that Nigeria must demonstrate this. Nigeria must also demonstrate her leadership position in the world. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption provides several opportunities which can be exploited by member states, including Nigeria, to ensure that funds that have been ill-gotten are repatriated and the men and women who engage in such unconscionable and harmful behavior are punished in accordance with the law, that the world may know that if you reap where you have not sown, there are consequences to it. It is also important to create an environment that is hostile for people to participate in corruption. We must also, as a country, look at the lifestyle of the individuals who engage in public office. How is it that in Africa, when an individual whom we knew to be a pauper is appointed as a public official, whom we knew to be a pauper is elected, permit me and forgive me at once, members of Senate and members of the House of Representatives, that no sooner have you set foot in the Senate or the House of Representatives than you become a millionaire and you begin to live as if money was not a problem. If it was so easy, why aren't all of us so rich? The privatization of public wealth without consequence is something that we must frown upon. And that is why lifestyle audits are important, and I urge you to enact legislation that will require Nigerians that before you build a house as a public servant, you must show us the source of your funds. You must tell us where you got the money. And if you did that, you'd be amazed that those who build mansions will be reduced by 99%. And corruption is something that also undermines democracy. That is the tragedy of corruption. And it has now been demonstrated that in the countries where corruption has been fought and fought successfully, democracy also thrives. I've already indicated to you countries such as Mauritius and Botswana, which are the only 2 countries in Africa ever to have had budget surpluses, because the leaders in those countries have been in the forefront in the fight against corruption. Corruption is even more difficult. A friend of mine, in an attempt to rationalize corruption, once said, "How is it that fish can swim in the ocean without water getting into its mouth?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When you work in the public service, how is it that you cannot take a little out of the public service?" And I told him, "You are not a fish, and if you are a fish, close your mouth when you are swimming." And he also told me, How can you be tethered around a tree and you do not graze on the grass that is around there? I said, you are not a cow, and even if you are, remember that the grass does not belong to you. There is no shortage of attempts at rationalizing corruption in Africa, and there is no way in which we are going to fight corruption without changing people's behavior. My prescription is that we must realize that those who engage in corruption belong to a different cadre of people, and that they must never be owned. The culture in many African countries that if a thief is from your tribe, you say, yes, we know he's a thief, but he's our thief. Must stop. This ownership of thieves, because they come from our ethnic groups, or they come from our social class, or they come from our religious circle, is one of the things that undermines the fight against corruption in many parts of Africa. We must therefore create an environment where those who engage in graft do not have places of refuge in their ethnic groups. We must not create an environment where when we punish people because they have engaged in graft, we then give them protection because they come from our tribes. It is a problem that is going to persist in a country such as Nigeria, but is only through the legislature, which comprises people from all parts of Nigeria, that we can ensure that these thieves are not given the oxygen to breathe so that they can suffocate through their iniquities.